I don't come from a legal background. Brexit isn't my research area, but I was doing my fieldwork during the referendum, and my fieldwork focused specifically on working class loyalist communities. So I do have some experience of the kind of debates that were going on there. And I just want to offer a couple of thoughts on how Greens can respond to populism, and then a couple of feminist critiques on what's happened to date. So we kind of need to be aware that we remain true to those Green values in how we respond to both Brexit and populist politics. I think it's helpful if we conceive of populism as a sort of pyramid scheme. You normally have some sort of amoral chief at the top who's telling the people in the tier below him, and it usually is a him, that it's in their interest to support his advancement. The middle tier then relay to the bottom tier, who are normally the working or workless classes, that if they give them the authority to do so, they'll deliver a golden age. And this has been touched on by two of the earlier speakers. The golden age itself is kind of loosely defined, but it's about a return to something better. We know mostly that the people at the top of the pyramid don't actually care about those at the bottom. It's a pyramid scheme because it's exploitative. It relies on every tier buying into the grand narrative, whatever that narrative is, and that worked in the case of Brexit. Those at the bottom will be people who are working class, maybe who don't traditionally vote. We saw a spike in votes during the referendum. Those who don't own property, people without passports, people in insecure forms of work, people who once worked in industry and manufacturing. If you look at the Joseph Rowntree research on who voted for Brexit, you'll see that in local areas where there were strong manufacturing industries, there were a higher support for Brexit. Populism is dangerous because it promises that the leaders will deliver change. There's nothing emancipatory about it, so it's the very opposite of what Greens aim to do. The participants, the bottom tier, everything rests on their support, but not necessarily their full participation. So I'll give a couple of points about what the Greens can do, and it's kind of the inverse of populism. And maybe most obviously, and as Lee pointed out, we should be deconstructing populist narratives because they don't offer any truth. There might be some post-structurists in the room who argue that there is no truth. I don't agree with post-structurists, so I'm going to say that there is some truth somewhere. They're offering simple solutions to complex problems. So, for example, and I hadn't thought deeply enough about it until I heard the first few comments there. But yeah, what if they don't deliver? We've riled people up into a state where we're going to take control of our borders and something significant will change. But just because we close the borders, we're not going to alter global capitalism. We're not going to deal with increasing automation or deindustrialization, these complex forces which have intersected to reduce some of the dissatisfaction, which then triggered support for Brexit. So essentially what the guys at the top and in the middle tier are doing are they're telling fairy tales to adults who perhaps should know better. And it's a form of political sleight of hand. It doesn't free anybody, and it is all for those at the top who, if you look at the negotiating team and you look at the comments of Davis and Johnson, you realise that they would have been okay regardless, and they will be okay regardless. They can move their money, they can move their families, they can go elsewhere, they can buy citizenship in one of the Arab Emirates if they want. So they're making decisions which they will not necessarily be impacted by. So what should Greens be doing, or what should progressives be doing? The first thing I think we should do is to reclaim reason and to challenge the rampant anti-intellectualism and the celebration of disorder which populism tends to stimulate. This kind of anti-intellectual tide, it's just really a shield for entrenched and powerful interests to consolidate their position. They're mobilising people at the bottom, telling them they can participate, that they'll be at the forefront. But that's the wrong way around for things to be done. As progressives, what we should be doing is developing movements which prioritise community education and action. That's not populism, that's emancipatory. There's a critical edge to it. Whenever people have undergone those processes, they're able to assess the world in a different way. They're not just taking part in a referendum, but they're transformed in some way. I think that we should be looking at kind of feminist and queer responses to Brexit, because a key part of the political repertoire of populism is masculinity, and it's white upper class masculinity. If you look at who led the Brexit campaigns, Johnson and Gove, Gove's former SPAD, Dominic Cummings, all of these narratives were very masculinist. They were about masculinist forms of security. So vote leave, take control. Yeah, it was about protecting the state and the national interest. Matthew Elliott, who's CEO of Vote Leave and the right-wing Taxpayers Alliance, he was another of the key kind of guys behind Brexit. They're all well-educated, white, upper-class men who shaped the public conversations on Europe, on what Europe was, what it stood for, who it served and who it failed. And a lot of people listened to their discourses. There were very few kind of publicly projected feminist conversations on Europe and on Brexit. Some of the most interesting research that I've read anyway on the Brexit vote to date has been the LSE produced a really good blog article on voter values, and the Runnymede Trust produced a report on race and class post-Brexit. And if we're interested in forming progressive alliances, strategic alliances, we should be looking at this research, because what they tell us is about voter motivations, and that tells us then about where there are gaps which Greens should be exploiting and addressing. So the LSE work, first of all, they're trying to figure out, if you had a certain piece of information about somebody, how confidently could you predict their position on Brexit, right? So they said that if you know their income and class, you have a 54% chance of knowing. But if you knew their views on the death penalty, we could increase that to 71%. So 71% of voters who support the death penalty state they're pro-Brexit, right? So this was essentially a battle of values. And this goes back to what Lee was talking about a return to the, bless you, golden age. Contrastingly, less than 20% of people who really oppose the death penalty were pro-Brexit, right? So you can see that kind of tally there. And I think this is some kind of desire for a moral, some form of moral certainty, to a return of kind of predictable and traditional values, which we no longer have. So, as Lee did point out, we're experiencing multiple forms of change. So the labour market has changed, social norms are changing, gender norms are changing. And if you look at the two major populist incidents in 2016, they appeared to be white masculinist responses to those forms of change, which encouraged then those at the bottom to come along for the ride, and they too would enjoy the bounty of the win. The second thing I think Greens and progressives need to do is really be critical and vigilant about the idea of a white working class, and this was a white working class backlash. It wasn't. You need to look carefully at the data on how people voted. A third of Asian voters voted for Brexit. In areas like Birmingham, a high percentage of all ethnic minorities voted for Brexit, and this kind of undermines the idea that this was a white working class backlash. If we want to be serious about deconstructing populist appeals and we want to offer something different, we have to challenge ways of discussing the working classes which racialise them and which separate workers of colour from white workers. As a response to populism then, we should be offering an alternative, and one of those alternatives are the green values of cooperation, solidarity, evidence, non-violence and non-domination. There are alternative ways of responding to some of the troubling changes which our communities are going through. I'm sure we all know that the solution is never to draw a circle around us and to police it vigilantly. So while we might be leaving Europe, we can retain the spirit of cooperation and the ultimate goal of the European project, which was to prevent violent conflict, and we should all be united in doing that. So populism might perform a democratic head count. It might get people to kind of put their hand up and say what they stand for, but we are for participatory democracy, such as we saw in the Republic of Ireland earlier this year. We want people to reflect on evidence, to deliberate over issues, to debate one another and reach conclusions on that basis. We don't just want them to tell us intuitively what they would like. And then finally, we need to consider how women are impacted by all of this. So the Brexit negotiating team has 1 woman out of 9. The UK population is 51 to 52% women. We've got 1 woman out of 9 on the team, and we know from research on female participation in politics that it tends to produce better outcomes, or at least pull in those issues which affect women from the margins to the centre. Women's Aid in Northern Ireland have been very vocal on Brexit. They've advanced their concerns publicly, made national statements about this, and the European Greens are committed not just to reforming institutions, but minimising the harms which might result from Brexit. So therefore, we should be taking the concerns of organisations such as Women's Aid seriously. We need to look at how laws governing sexual and domestic violence, safeguards for part-time workers, who are disproportionately women, the fundamental ideas of human rights and gender equality which Europe offered us. We need to look at where they're going to be located in a post-Brexit environment. So all of these are women's issues. and they should be at the forefront of any progressive response to this latest populist event. Yeah, I said earlier, one of the troubling things about the Brexit debate was that it was about masculine power in politics, and what it did was it juxtaposed the idea of a secure state and the national interest with social justice and rights, and we were told that we had to choose one over the other, and we're now being told that the people chose security over rights, and therefore it's a triumph for security to minimise or deprioritise rights. That's not the case, as we know, and we also know that feminist security scholars will give a very different vision of what security means: security of people, security of health, security of access to education, as opposed to protecting the national interest. And then finally, as Greens, we have a duty to produce counter-narratives which will offer people something else to hold on to. So yes, we are going through periods of rapid change, things are changing. Some people are uncomfortable with it for what I would deem legitimate reasons. Some people are adjusting to a loss of privilege, which they were never entitled to in the first place. But just again, a little bit of evidence from the Joseph Rowntree research. People opposed to equal rights for women and gay people were 80% likely to vote for Brexit. So what we're entering into now, and I'll not talk about the legislative bit because that's not my background, but we're facing a new legislative landscape where we as Greens have to protect the rights of all of those minority groups, but we're also immersed in a new discursive landscape where we have to be vigilant about these issues as well, and that those people who felt that they triumphed were less interested in protecting women, less interested in rehabilitating people who had performed criminality, and more interested in protecting the nation, however that is defined. So both of those things require our attention and should be part of any progressive green alternative. So thank you very much. Cheers.